Picture this. A single businessman becomes so wealthy that kings and emperors literally beg him for loans. Not metaphorically, literally beg. They write pleading letters, offer their crown jewels as collateral, and promise him anything he wants. This man doesn't just lend money, he decides who rules entire nations. When an emperor dies, this businessman essentially chooses the next one by deciding which candidate gets the massive bribes needed to secure votes. Sounds like modern corporate influence on politics. This was happening 500 years ago, and the man orchestrating it all was Jakob Fugger, a name that should be as famous as Rockefeller or Rothschild, but somehow got buried by history. Most people have never heard of Jakob Fugger, yet he might be the most important businessman who ever lived. While Columbus was discovering the New World, Fugger was creating an entirely new kind of world, one where financial power trumped royal blood, where a merchant family could make and break dynasties, where money became the ultimate form of political authority. The implications of what he achieved echo through every modern political system, every central bank, every too-big-to-fail institution we see today. Jakob wasn't born into royalty. He started as a weaver's son in Augsburg, a prosperous but unremarkable German trading city. Yet by the time he died in 1525, he controlled the finances of the Holy Roman Empire, owned silver mines across Europe, held monopolies on precious metals, and had personally installed 2 different emperors on their thrones. His family's wealth was estimated to be equivalent to roughly $400 billion in today's money, making him potentially richer than Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk combined. But unlike modern billionaires who influence politics from the sidelines, Fugger didn't just buy influence, he bought entire political systems. The traditional story of medieval Europe is one of feudalism, lords, serfs, warriors, and priests. Power came from land, bloodlines, and swords, but running parallel to this familiar narrative was something far more modern and far more revolutionary: the rise of financial capitalism. While knights fought with lances, Fugger fought with ledgers. While nobles claimed authority through God and ancestry, he claimed it through debt and compound interest. The medieval world wasn't just agricultural and feudal, it was becoming recognizably capitalist, and Jakob Fugger was writing the playbook. Understanding Fugger's story means understanding how our modern world really works. Every time we see corporations influencing elections, every time we wonder how banks became too big to fail, every time we question whether elected officials serve voters or donors, we're seeing the legacy of systems that Jakob Fugger pioneered 5 centuries ago. He proved that money could buy empires, quite literally, and once he proved it, that knowledge never went away. The Holy Roman Empire that Fugger bought was the closest thing medieval Europe had to a superpower. It sprawled across modern-day Germany, Austria, Czech Republic, parts of Italy, and much of Central Europe. The emperor wasn't just a figurehead. He commanded armies, controlled trade routes, issued currency, and shaped the religious and political destiny of millions. Yet this vast empire became, in many ways, a subsidiary of the Fugger banking house. When the emperor needed money for war, he came to Fugger. When princes needed loans for their territories, they came to Fugger. When the Pope needed financing for St. Peter's Basilica, even he came to Fugger. But here's what makes this more than just a story about one rich man. Fugger didn't just accumulate wealth, he fundamentally changed how wealth and power related to each other. Before him, rich merchants served kings. After him, kings served rich merchants. He created a template that modern financial elites have been following ever since. Every central bank, every major financial institution, every public-private partnership that seems to benefit private parties more than the public, they're all variations on innovations that Fugger pioneered. The most stunning example of his power came in 1519, when Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I died. The position of emperor wasn't inherited. It was elected by 7 powerful nobles called electors. The candidates included Charles V of Spain, Francis III of France, and Henry VIII of England. Each was willing to pay massive bribes to secure votes. This should have been decided by politics, alliances, and military strength. Instead, it was decided by one man's checkbook. Fugger personally financed Charles V's campaign with what would be about $20 million today. an astronomical sum that completely outbid the other candidates. Charles won, becoming the most powerful man in Europe, and he owed it all to a banker in Augsburg. Think about that for a moment. The leader of the largest empire in Europe was chosen not by military conquest, not by political skill, not even by noble birthright, but by whoever could secure the biggest loan from Jakob Fugger. It's as if today a single bank CEO could decide who becomes president of the United States simply by choosing which candidate to fund. Except Fugger's power was even more concentrated, because there were no regulatory agencies, no public oversight, no democratic processes to constrain him. This is where Fugger's story connects to our modern world in ways that should make anyone uncomfortable. Today, we debate whether billionaires have too much political influence. Fugger shows us what happens when that influence becomes total. Today we worry about banks that are too big to fail. Fugger was literally too big to fail. If he had collapsed, the entire Holy Roman Empire would have gone bankrupt along with him. Today we see revolving doors between government and finance. Fugger's organization was essentially a parallel government, making decisions that official governments merely implemented. The techniques Fugger used weren't just medieval curiosities, they're blueprints for modern financial control. He pioneered double-entry bookkeeping, international banking, complex derivatives, monopolistic practices, regulatory capture, and debt-based political control. He created correspondent banking networks across Europe, allowing him to move money instantly while his competitors moved actual coins across dangerous roads. He vertical integrated his businesses, owning everything from silver mines to textile production to trading companies. He used accounting innovations to hide the true extent of his wealth and power from competitors and authorities. Most importantly, he understood something about debt that most people still don't grasp: the difference between owing money and being owed money. Kings and emperors thought borrowing made them powerful. It gave them immediate funds for wars and building projects. Fugger understood that lending made him powerful. It gave him leverage over everyone who owed him. When you owe the bank $1 million, you have a problem. When the Holy Roman Emperor owes you millions of dollars, the emperor has a problem. Fugger grasped this principle before anyone else, and he used it to turn the entire political structure of Europe into his personal asset. The deeper story here isn't just about medieval banking. It's about the birth of financial capitalism as a political system. Before Fugger, money served politics. Kings controlled currency, set interest rates, and regulated trade to serve their political goals. Fugger flipped this relationship. Under his system, politics served money. Politicians became the marketing department for financial interests. Public policy became a customer service function for private creditors. Democracy became a mechanism for legitimizing decisions that were actually made in boardrooms and bank offices. This transformation didn't happen through conquest or revolution, it happened through innovation and debt. Fugger didn't need to overthrow the Holy Roman Empire. He simply made it dependent on him, then shaped its policies to serve his interests. The emperors still wore the crown and gave the speeches, but Fugger wrote the real agenda. It's a form of control that's more subtle than dictatorship, but potentially more powerful, because the controlled party doesn't realize they're being controlled. As we'll see throughout this story, every major innovation in financial capitalism can be traced back to techniques that Jakob Fugger either invented or perfected. Modern derivatives markets, international banking, corporate monopolies, lobbying, regulatory capture, central banking, debt-based money, and even the basic concept of shareholder capitalism, all have their roots in what this one man built in 16th century Europe. Understanding his methods isn't just historical curiosity, it's essential for understanding how our contemporary world actually works. The question isn't whether Fugger was good or evil. Moral categories don't really apply to systemic innovations. The question is whether we understand what he created and whether we're comfortable with a world built on his principles. Because make no mistake, we're still living in Jakob Fugger's world. Every time we see corporations writing their own regulations, politicians serving banker interests, or financial crises requiring public bailouts of private institutions, we're seeing his innovations in action. This is the story of how one man's genius fundamentally changed the relationship between money and power in ways that still shape our world today. It's the story of the first great financier, the first too-big-to-fail institution, and the first time in history that someone literally bought an empire. But more than that, it's the origin story of modern capitalism itself. Chapter 2. Weaver's Son. The story begins not in palaces or counting houses, but in the workshops of Augsburg, where the steady rhythm of looms created the foundation for history's greatest financial empire. Hans Fugger, Jakob's grandfather, arrived in this prosperous German trading city sometime in the 1360s, with nothing but the skills of a weaver and the ambition to build something lasting. He couldn't have imagined that his craft would eventually evolve into a business model that would reshape European politics. But the seeds of that transformation were already present in the innovations he brought to textile production. Medieval Augsburg was perfectly positioned to become a financial capital, though no one recognized this at the time. Located at the intersection of ancient trade routes connecting Italy to northern Europe, the city hummed with commercial activity that would have seemed modern to contemporary observers. Merchants from Venice brought silk and spices north, while German traders carried silver, copper, and manufactured goods south. This constant flow of valuable commodities required sophisticated financial services, currency exchange, credit arrangements, shipping insurance, and trade financing. The technical infrastructure for international banking was developing naturally from the practical needs of long-distance commerce. Hans Fugger understood something that most craftsmen missed. The real profits weren't in making things, but in organizing how things got made and moved. Instead of simply weaving cloth, he began importing raw cotton and other materials, controlling more steps in the production process. Instead of selling only to local customers, he established relationships with traders who could move his products across Europe. Most importantly, instead of working alone, he began coordinating networks of other craftsmen, essentially creating one of Europe's first vertically integrated textile companies. The transition from craftsman to coordinator required new kinds of skills that would later prove crucial in banking. Hans had to track complex supply chains, manage relationships with suppliers and customers across vast distances, coordinate payment schedules, and handle multiple currencies. He needed to understand credit terms, interest calculations, and currency fluctuations. Without realizing it, he was developing the analytical frameworks that would later be applied to international finance. When his son Andreas expanded the business further, these frameworks became even more sophisticated. Andreas Fugger took his father's innovations and scaled them dramatically. By the 1440s, the family business had evolved from a single workshop into a trading company with operations across Central Europe. Andreas established permanent representatives in major commercial cities, created standardized contracts for complex transactions, and developed accounting systems that could track profits and losses across multiple businesses simultaneously. These might seem like mundane operational details, but they were actually revolutionary advances in business organization that would soon be applied to much larger challenges. The real breakthrough came when Andreas began dealing directly with nobility and church officials who needed luxury textiles for ceremonies and displays of wealth. This brought the Fuggers into contact with Europe's power elite at a crucial moment in economic history. The late medieval period was characterized by chronic cash shortages among even the wealthiest nobles. Feudal wealth was tied up in land and agricultural production, but political ambitions required liquid capital for armies, fortifications, and diplomatic gifts. Traditional banking was limited by religious prohibitions against charging interest, creating a massive gap between the demand for credit and its availability. Andreas recognized this gap as an opportunity. He began offering payment terms to noble customers that were essentially disguised loans. Instead of charging interest directly, he would inflate the prices of goods sold on credit, effectively building the interest into the purchase price. This technically complied with religious law while providing both parties with what they needed. For nobles, it meant access to luxury goods without immediate payment. For the Fuggers, it meant higher profit margins and deeper relationships with powerful customers who would become increasingly dependent on these financial arrangements. This innovation marked the family's transition from traders to financiers, though the distinction wasn't yet clear to anyone involved. By the 1460s, when Jakob was born, the Fugger business model had already evolved far beyond textiles. They were essentially running a primitive investment bank, using profits from trade to finance ever larger commercial ventures. Jakob would inherit not just a successful company, but a set of proven techniques for converting economic opportunity into political influence. Jakob Fugger was born into this environment in 1459, making him perfectly positioned to recognize and exploit the massive changes transforming European commerce. His childhood coincided with several technological and cultural shifts that would create unprecedented opportunities for financial innovation. The printing press was revolutionizing communication, making it possible to coordinate complex business operations across vast distances. New navigation techniques were opening up global trade routes that would eventually bring enormous wealth from the Americas and Asia. Most importantly, the political structure of Europe was shifting in ways that created enormous demand for financial services. The Holy Roman Empire, in particular, was fragmenting into hundreds of semi-independent territories, each ruled by princes, dukes, and archbishops who competed constantly with their neighbors. This competition required money, for armies, for fortifications, for ceremonies that displayed power and legitimacy. Traditional sources of funding were proving inadequate for these new political realities. Taxation was limited by feudal agreements that hadn't anticipated modern warfare costs. Agricultural income was constrained by weather and population limits. Church income was being challenged by reform movements. The stage was set for a new kind of financing that could meet these expanded political needs. Jakob's education reflected his family's evolution from craftsmen to financiers. Unlike most merchants who learned through apprenticeship in a single trade, Jakob studied with humanist scholars who taught mathematics, Latin, and the new double-entry bookkeeping techniques being developed in Italy. These subjects might seem academic, but they provided crucial tools for the kind of complex international finance that the family business was moving toward. Double-entry bookkeeping in particular made it possible to track profits and losses across multiple enterprises simultaneously, creating the analytical foundation for modern corporate accounting. More importantly, Jakob's education included extensive study of legal and religious texts related to commerce and finance. The medieval church's prohibition against usury created enormous complexity around any financial transaction, requiring detailed knowledge of theological arguments about what constituted legitimate commerce versus forbidden interest charging. Jakob became expert in crafting financial arrangements that provided the economic benefits of loans while maintaining technical compliance with religious law. This expertise would later prove crucial when dealing with church officials and religiously conservative nobles who needed financing but couldn't openly acknowledge borrowing money at interest. The young Jakob also traveled extensively throughout Europe as part of his business education, establishing relationships that would later prove invaluable. He spent time in Venice learning advanced banking techniques from Italian merchants who were pioneering international finance. He visited Antwerp and other Flemish cities where new forms of commercial organization were being developed. He established contacts in major mining regions where extraction of silver and copper was expanding rapidly. By the time he took control of family operations in the 1480s, he possessed both the technical skills and personal network necessary for the next phase of expansion. The specific innovation that transformed the Fuggers from successful merchants into financial revolutionaries was Jakob's decision to directly invest in mining operations rather than simply trading in metals. This shift represented a fundamental change in business strategy from facilitating commerce to controlling production. Instead of buying silver and copper from miners and then selling to manufacturers, the Fuggers began owning the mines themselves, employing the miners, controlling the output, and dictating the terms under which metals reached the market. This vertical integration strategy had profound implications that extended far beyond mining profits. By controlling metal production, the Fuggers gained influence over currency systems throughout Europe, since most coins were made from silver and copper. By owning mines in multiple territories, They became essential partners for the local rulers, who depended on mining taxes for government revenue. By employing thousands of miners and associated workers, they gained political influence in regions where their operations were concentrated. Most importantly, by controlling the supply of precious metals, they gained leverage over anyone who needed these materials, which included virtually every government and major commercial enterprise in Europe. The technical challenges of managing mining operations forced the Fuggers to develop new forms of business organization that resembled modern corporations more than traditional medieval enterprises. Mining required enormous upfront investments, complex engineering projects, sophisticated supply chains for equipment and materials, and coordinated management of large workforces. Success depended on accurate financial planning, careful risk assessment, and efficient coordination of activities across multiple locations. These requirements pushed the Fuggers to develop managerial techniques and organizational structures that wouldn't become common in other businesses for several centuries. The political implications of their mining control became apparent during the 1490s, when European silver production increased dramatically due to new extraction techniques and expanded operations. Traditional monetary systems, based on relatively scarce precious metals, couldn't accommodate this increased supply without significant inflation. The Fuggers found themselves in the position of managing not just their own business interests, but the monetary stability of entire regions. Local rulers began consulting with Jakob about currency policies. Merchants across Europe adjusted their pricing strategies based on Fugger mining output. Even distant kingdoms modified their trade relationships in response to changes in silver availability. This was the crucial turning point where business success transformed into political power. Jakob realized that controlling the raw materials for currency gave him indirect control over currency systems themselves. By adjusting mining output, he could influence inflation rates across Europe. By choosing which rulers gained access to silver and copper on favorable terms, he could affect their military and political capabilities. By coordinating with other major mining operations, he could shape market conditions across entire regions. The step from there to direct political involvement was logical and almost inevitable. The final piece of Jakob's revolutionary business model was the integration of mining, manufacturing, trading, and banking into a single coordinated system. The Fuggers used profits from mining to finance their own manufacturing operations, reducing costs and ensuring reliable supply chains. They used their manufacturing capabilities to produce goods needed by their mining operations, creating a closed-loop system that minimized external dependencies. They used their trading networks to distribute their own products while gathering intelligence about market conditions and political developments. They used their banking operations to finance expansion of their industrial activities while generating additional revenue from financial services. By the early 1500s, this integrated approach had created something unprecedented in European history. A business organization that operated simultaneously as a mining company, manufacturing company, trading company, and bank, with operations spanning most of the continent and political relationships reaching the highest levels of government and church hierarchy. Jakob hadn't just built a successful business. He had created a new form of economic organization that challenged traditional distinctions between commercial and political power. The scale of what he achieved becomes clear when we consider the numbers. At its peak, the Fugger organization controlled roughly 50% of European copper production and 20% of silver production. They operated mines in modern-day Germany, Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, Spain, and Peru. Their trading networks reached from London to Constantinople, from Stockholm to Naples. Their banking operations provided credit to emperors, kings, princes, archbishops, and major merchant houses across Europe. Their total assets represented roughly 2% of the entire European economy, equivalent to a single company today controlling assets worth about $1.5 trillion. But the most revolutionary aspect of Jakob's achievement wasn't its scale, but its integration. Unlike modern corporations, which typically specialize in particular industries, the Fugger organization operated across every sector of the economy simultaneously. This gave Jakob unique insights into how different parts of the economic system interacted with each other, and unique opportunities to coordinate activities across traditional boundaries. When he made a decision about mining output, he could immediately see its effects on currency markets, manufacturing costs, trade relationships, and government finances. This systemic perspective would prove crucial when he began leveraging economic power into direct political control. As Jakob assumed full control of family operations in the early 1500s, he possessed advantages that no previous businessman had ever enjoyed. Technical expertise in advanced finance, an integrated business organization spanning multiple industries, political relationships at the highest levels of European society, and most importantly, a systematic understanding of how economic and political power could be made to serve each other. The stage was set for innovations that would fundamentally change the relationship between money and politics in ways that still shape our world today. Chapter 3. The Innovation. The invention that would transform Jakob Fugger from a successful businessman into the architect of modern financial capitalism wasn't a piece of technology. It was an accounting innovation so subtle that most people didn't recognize its revolutionary implications until decades after its implementation. Double-entry bookkeeping seems mundane today, but in the early 1500s, it represented a conceptual breakthrough comparable to the development of written language or mathematical notation. It made possible for the first time in human history the precise measurement and management of financial complexity on a scale that could encompass entire economies. Before double-entry bookkeeping, business accounting was essentially sophisticated list-making. Merchants kept records of what they owned, what they owed, and what others owed them, but these records couldn't reveal the overall financial health of complex enterprises or track the profitability of specific activities within larger business operations. This limitation meant that large-scale commercial ventures were essentially impossible to manage rationally. You could track individual transactions, but you couldn't analyze systematic patterns or optimize overall performance. Business expansion beyond a certain scale became literally unmanageable. Jakob's mastery of double-entry techniques, learned from Italian banking houses during his youth, gave him analytical capabilities that his competitors couldn't match. Every transaction in his business empire was recorded twice, once as a debit in one account and once as a credit in another. This redundancy wasn't just about preventing arithmetic errors. It created a mathematical framework for understanding how different parts of a complex business related to each other. For the first time, it became possible to track precisely how investments in one area affected profits in another, how changes in one market influenced performance across multiple markets, and how overall business health could be optimized through coordinated decision-making. The practical implications were staggering. Jakob could analyze the profitability of individual mines, specific trade routes, particular manufacturing processes, and different types of financial services with mathematical precision that his competitors couldn't approach. He could predict how political changes in one region would affect business operations in distant areas. He could optimize the allocation of capital across multiple enterprises to maximize overall returns. Most importantly, he could make the entire Fugger organization function as a single coordinated system rather than a collection of separate businesses that happened to be owned by the same family. This analytical capability transformed the Fuggers' relationship with their customers and political partners. Traditional business relationships were based on mutual familiarity and informal trust. Jakob could offer something entirely different: mathematical precision in financial planning. When Emperor Maximilian needed funding for military campaigns, Jakob could provide detailed analysis of costs, repayment schedules, and the economic impact of different strategic options. When mining operations required investment, he could calculate precise return projections and optimize financing structures. When trade relationships needed renegotiation, he could model various scenarios and their long-term implications. Political leaders found this analytical approach irresistible because it promised to make governance itself more rational and predictable. Instead of making decisions based on intuition and tradition, rulers could base policies on mathematical analysis of costs and benefits. Instead of hoping that military campaigns would somehow pay for themselves through plunder, emperors could plan campaigns with realistic budgets and measurable objectives. Instead of treating government finances as a mysterious craft practiced by clerks, political leaders could understand and control their own economic situation. This was the crucial innovation that transformed economic power into political control. Jakob wasn't just providing money to political leaders, he was providing the analytical frameworks they used to make decisions about money. When Emperor Maximilian planned a campaign, he relied on Fugger analysis to determine what was financially feasible. When territorial princes considered major expenditures, they consulted Fugger projections to understand the long-term implications. When church officials planned construction projects, they used Fugger financial models to structure their funding strategies. Jakob hadn't just become their banker, he had become their strategic planning department. The system worked because it provided genuine value to political clients while advancing Fugger interests simultaneously. Political leaders received more sophisticated financial planning than they could have developed internally. Jakob gained detailed knowledge of government operations and influence over major policy decisions. Both parties benefited in ways that made the relationship seem collaborative rather than exploitative. This mutually beneficial character disguised the extent to which political decision-making was being shaped by commercial priorities rather than public interests. The mathematical precision of double-entry bookkeeping also solved a crucial problem in medieval finance: how to charge interest while maintaining technical compliance with religious law. Traditional loans with explicit interest rates violated church teachings about usury. But complex business partnerships with shared risks and profits were theologically acceptable, even when they produced results economically identical to interest-bearing loans. Jakob's accounting systems could structure any financial arrangement to appear as a legitimate business partnership while functioning as a loan with predetermined returns. These disguised interest arrangements became the foundation for a new form of relationship between political and economic power. Instead of borrowing money directly, rulers entered into partnership arrangements with the Fuggers that provided immediate funding in exchange for future revenues from specific sources: mining taxes, trade duties, territorial rents, or ecclesiastical income. The mathematical complexity of these arrangements made it difficult for outside observers to determine whether rulers were borrowing money or engaging in legitimate business ventures. This ambiguity provided political cover for relationships that might otherwise have seemed inappropriate. The most revolutionary aspect of Jakob's financial innovations was their scalability. Traditional medieval finance was limited by personal relationships and informal trust networks. You could only lend money to people you knew personally, and only in amounts that individual lenders could afford to lose. Double-entry bookkeeping made possible for the first time large-scale financial operations that could span continents and involve dozens of parties simultaneously. Risk could be calculated mathematically, rather than estimated intuitively. Complex financial instruments could be created to share risks among multiple participants. Most importantly, financial relationships could be separated from personal relationships, making possible business arrangements that transcended traditional social and political boundaries. Jakob exploited this scalability to create financial instruments that were essentially early versions of modern derivatives and securities. He developed contracts that allowed investors to purchase shares in mining operations without directly managing the mines. He created arrangements that let rulers borrow against future tax revenues without technically selling government bonds. He designed insurance products that protected merchants against specific types of commercial risks. He even pioneered early forms of currency hedging that protected businesses against exchange rate fluctuations. These financial innovations had profound political implications that extended far beyond their immediate commercial purposes. By creating mathematical frameworks for managing large-scale risks and investments, Jakob made possible political projects that would have been impossible under traditional financing systems. Emperors could plan multi-year military campaigns with reliable funding streams. Princes could invest in infrastructure projects that wouldn't pay off for decades. Church officials could finance construction projects spanning multiple generations. The scale and scope of political ambition expanded dramatically once mathematical finance made long-term planning feasible. But the most important political consequence of Jakob's financial innovations was more subtle. They changed the fundamental relationship between economic and political authority. Traditional medieval governance was based on personal relationships, inherited rights, and religious legitimacy. Political power came from noble birth, military prowess, or divine appointment. Economic activity served political objectives defined by rulers according to their own priorities and values. Jakob's innovations inverted this relationship by making political activity dependent on economic analysis performed by technical experts. Under the new system, political feasibility became synonymous with financial feasibility, as defined by Fugger accounting methods. Political objectives that couldn't be justified mathematically became impractical regardless of their potential military or diplomatic value. Political strategies that didn't optimize economic returns became wasteful, even if they served important social or cultural functions. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, political decision-making became subordinated to economic optimization, as defined by the analytical frameworks that only Jakob and his associates fully understood. This subordination wasn't imposed through force or explicit agreement. It evolved naturally as political leaders became dependent on mathematical analysis they couldn't replicate independently. Once rulers began making decisions based on Fugger financial projections, they couldn't stop using these projections without returning to the inferior decision-making methods they had used previously. Once they structured their finances according to Fugger recommendations, they couldn't change these structures without jeopardizing arrangements that had become essential to their political survival. Once they accepted the premises underlying Fugger accounting methods, they found themselves operating within logical frameworks that consistently led toward conclusions favorable to Fugger interests. The genius of this system was that it didn't require deception or coercion to function effectively. Political leaders genuinely believed they were making independent decisions based on objective analysis. The mathematical rigor of double-entry bookkeeping created an impression of scientific neutrality that disguised the extent to which the analytical frameworks themselves embodied particular assumptions about how political and economic priorities should be balanced. Jakob wasn't manipulating rulers. He was providing them with intellectual tools that made his preferred outcomes appear logically inevitable. By the 1510s, this system had evolved to the point where major political decisions throughout the Holy Roman Empire were effectively being made in Augsburg, rather than in the courts of rulers who believed themselves to be in charge. The emperor and territorial princes retained formal authority and public visibility, but the actual content of policies was increasingly determined by financial analysis that only the Fuggers could perform. Jakob had achieved something unprecedented in human history. He had made economic expertise more politically powerful than traditional forms of political authority. This transformation laid the groundwork for the even more dramatic innovations that would follow. Once Jakob had demonstrated that mathematical finance could be used to shape political decision-making, the next logical step was to use these same techniques to control political leadership selection itself. The election of Holy Roman emperors, previously determined by military alliances and noble politics, was about to become another application of Fugger financial engineering. The stage was set for the ultimate demonstration of how money could, quite literally, buy political power. Chapter 4. Mining silver, minting power. The transformation of Jakob Fugger from innovative banker to political kingmaker began deep underground, in the silver mines of Schwarz in the Austrian Tyrol, where new extraction techniques were unleashing unprecedented quantities of precious metal onto European markets. What started as a business opportunity, investing in mining technology that could extract silver more efficiently than traditional methods, evolved into something much more significant: control over the basic material from which political power was constructed in the 16th century. Silver wasn't just valuable. It was the foundation of currency systems, the basis for international trade, and the raw material from which rulers financed armies, built fortifications, and purchased political loyalty. Jakob's entry into mining came at a crucial historical moment. European demand for silver was exploding due to expanding trade with Asia, where Chinese merchants preferred silver payments over other forms of currency. Simultaneously, new mining techniques developed in Germany were making it possible to extract silver from ore deposits that had previously been uneconomical to work. The combination of increased demand and improved supply created opportunities for enormous profits, but only for investors who could provide the substantial upfront capital required for modern mining operations. Traditional mining had been a small-scale activity dominated by local craftsmen who worked surface deposits with hand tools and simple techniques. The new methods required massive investments in equipment, complex engineering projects to reach deeper deposits, sophisticated logistics networks to transport materials and workers, and advanced metallurgical knowledge to process different types of ore efficiently. Most importantly, they required access to capital on a scale that exceeded the resources of traditional mining communities. This created an opening for financiers like Jakob, who could provide the investment needed to modernize extraction operations. Jakob's approach to mining investment revealed the same systematic thinking that characterized his other business activities. Instead of simply providing loans to existing miners, he insisted on direct ownership stakes that gave him control over mining operations. Instead of investing in individual mines, he created coordinated networks of mining enterprises that could share technical innovations and economic risks. Instead of limiting himself to extraction, he invested in the entire supply chain from mining through processing to distribution. Most importantly, instead of treating mining as an isolated business sector, he integrated it with his banking, trading, and manufacturing operations to create synergies that multiplied his competitive advantages. The scale of Jakob's mining investments was staggering by medieval standards. By the 1510s, the Fugger organization controlled mining operations that employed tens of thousands of workers across dozens of locations. Their Schwaz operations alone produced roughly 20,000 pounds of silver annually, enough to mint millions of coins or purchase thousands of tons of grain. Their copper mining operations in Hungary produced even larger quantities of metal used for everything from weapons manufacturing to currency production. Their combined mining output represented a substantial fraction of total European metal production, giving them disproportionate influence over commodity markets throughout the continent. But the political implications of this mining control extended far beyond market influence. In the early 16th century, most European rulers depended on mining taxes as a crucial source of government revenue. Territorial princes who controlled mining regions received substantial payments from mining operations, often representing 20 to 30% of their total income. These mining taxes funded military forces, administrative operations, diplomatic activities, and major construction projects. When Jakob gained control over mining operations, he simultaneously gained influence over the government finances of rulers whose territories contained his mines. This influence operated through mechanisms that were subtle but powerful. When mining operations expanded, government revenues increased, making rulers more optimistic about expensive political projects. When mining operations contracted, government revenues decreased, forcing rulers to reconsider their priorities or seek alternative funding sources. Jakob could influence these revenue fluctuations through decisions about production levels, investment in new equipment, employment of additional workers, and development of new mining sites. He didn't need to explicitly threaten rulers. He simply needed to make business decisions that had predictable political consequences. The relationship between mining control and political influence became even more direct through the currency implications of silver production. Most European currencies in this period were based on silver content, meaning that the value and stability of money depended on steady silver supplies. When silver production increased rapidly, it could cause inflation that undermined existing currency systems. When silver supplies became unreliable, it could cause deflation that damaged commercial activity. Jakob's control over substantial silver production meant that his business decisions affected monetary stability across multiple territories simultaneously. Rulers quickly learned that maintaining good relationships with Jakob was essential for monetary stability in their territories. When he was pleased with government policies, silver supplies remained steady and currencies maintained their value. When he was dissatisfied with political developments, silver supplies might become irregular, causing economic uncertainty that made governance more difficult. This dynamic gave Jakob indirect but significant influence over government policies related to trade regulation, taxation, labor laws, and even religious affairs that might affect his business operations. The most sophisticated aspect of Jakob's mining strategy was his use of technical innovations to create competitive advantages that were difficult for rivals to replicate. Traditional mining relied on techniques that could be learned through apprenticeship and applied with relatively simple equipment. The new extraction methods required mathematical knowledge, engineering skills, and metallurgical expertise that took years to develop and could only be applied with expensive specialized equipment. Jakob invested heavily in acquiring and developing this technical knowledge, creating intellectual property advantages that protected his market position. These technical advantages were reinforced by the scale advantages that came from coordinated operations across multiple mining sites. Jakob's mining enterprises could share the costs of developing new extraction techniques, pool resources for major equipment purchases, coordinate supply chains to reduce transportation costs, and standardize operations to improve efficiency. Individual mining operations owned by traditional miners couldn't achieve these scale economies, making it difficult for them to compete with Fugger operations, even when they had access to high-quality ore deposits. The combination of technical and scale advantages allowed Jakob to offer political leaders deals that traditional miners couldn't match. When rulers needed immediate revenue, Jakob could advance substantial sums against future mining taxes. When territories required investment in mining infrastructure, he could provide both capital and technical expertise. When political emergencies demanded rapid increases in silver production, his coordinated operations could respond more quickly than independent miners. These capabilities made him an indispensable partner for rulers whose political survival depended on reliable access to mineral resources. Jakob's mining operations also served as intelligence networks that provided him with detailed knowledge about political and economic developments across Europe. Mining communities were typically located in remote areas where government control was limited and information moved freely among workers from different territories. Miners, metallurgists, and associated merchants often traveled between different mining regions, carrying news about political developments, military preparations, trade conditions, and technological innovations. Jakob's mining managers were positioned to gather this information systematically and report significant developments to Augsburg. This intelligence capability proved crucial when Jakob began making major political investments. He could track military preparations by monitoring increased demand for copper and iron in particular regions. He could anticipate currency crises by analyzing changes in silver demand from different territories. He could identify political instability by observing disruptions in mining operations caused by administrative problems or territorial conflicts. His mining operations provided him with early warning systems that helped him anticipate and respond to political developments that might affect his other business interests. The political influence generated by Jakob's mining control became most apparent during negotiations over major government contracts and policy decisions. When rulers needed large amounts of silver for currency production, military funding, or diplomatic payments, they typically had limited options for obtaining these materials quickly. Jakob's operations could provide immediate access to substantial quantities of silver, but often at prices and on terms that served his broader business interests. Rulers who needed silver urgently found themselves accepting arrangements that gave Jakob influence over other aspects of government policy. These arrangements often involved complex linkages between mining contracts and other business relationships. A ruler who needed silver for currency production might agree to purchase other products from Fugger trading operations. A territory that required investment in mining infrastructure might agree to favorable terms for Fugger banking operations. A prince who wanted reliable access to mineral resources might grant tax exemptions or trading privileges that benefited multiple Fugger enterprises simultaneously. Over time, these interconnected arrangements created webs of mutual dependency that made it difficult for rulers to challenge Jakob's interests in any area without jeopardizing their access to essential resources in other areas. By the mid-1510s, Jakob's mining operations had evolved into something unprecedented in European history. A business enterprise that exercised quasi-governmental functions across multiple territories while remaining formally independent of any political authority. His mining operations employed populations larger than many cities, generated tax revenues that supported territorial governments, controlled resources essential for currency stability, and provided intelligence about political and economic developments across the continent. This combination of economic scale and political influence created a foundation of power that would soon enable even more dramatic interventions in European politics. The stage was set for Jakob's most audacious political innovation, using his mining-generated wealth and influence to directly control the selection of political leadership at the highest levels of the Holy Roman Empire. The election of 1519, when Emperor Maximilian I died and left the imperial throne vacant, would demonstrate just how completely economic power could be converted into political control when wielded by someone who understood the mathematical relationships between money, resources, and political authority. Chapter 5. The Election. Money could buy. The death of Emperor Maximilian I in January 1519 created the most expensive political auction in European history, and Jakob Fugger was about to prove that he had enough money to buy the entire Holy Roman Empire. The imperial election that followed wasn't just a contest between rival candidates. It was a demonstration of how completely financial power had transformed the nature of political authority in early modern Europe. What should have been decided by noble alliances, military strength, and diplomatic skill was instead determined by whoever could secure the largest loans from history's first international banker. The Holy Roman Empire wasn't just another medieval kingdom. It was the closest thing Europe had to a superstate, encompassing modern-day Germany, Austria, Czech Republic, parts of Italy, and much of Central Europe. The emperor commanded armies numbering in the tens of thousands, controlled trade routes that generated enormous commercial revenues, issued currency that was accepted across the continent, and held ultimate authority over the religious and political destiny of perhaps 15 million people. In theory, imperial authority was granted by God and confirmed through election by 7 powerful nobles called electors. In practice, the election of 1519 would be determined by one man's checkbook. The leading candidates represented the most powerful dynasties in Europe. Charles I of Spain brought the wealth of a growing colonial empire, control over lucrative trade routes to the Americas, and the political support of Spanish and Flemish territories. Francis I of France offered the resources of Europe's most centralized monarchy, military forces that had recently demonstrated their effectiveness in Italian campaigns, and diplomatic relationships that spanned the continent. Henry VIII of England possessed the emerging naval power of an island kingdom, substantial financial resources from expanding international trade, and strategic flexibility that came from geographic isolation. Each candidate had legitimate claims to imperial authority and substantial resources to support their ambitions. Under traditional medieval politics, this competition would have been resolved through a complex process of noble alliance building, military demonstrations, and diplomatic negotiations that might have taken months or years to conclude. The electors, the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, the King of Bohemia, the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg, and the Count Palatine of the Rhine, would have carefully weighed the military capabilities, political reliability, and dynastic legitimacy of each candidate before making their choice. Personal relationships, family connections, and traditional loyalties would have played crucial roles in determining the outcome. But by 1519, traditional medieval politics had been fundamentally transformed by the innovations that Jakob Fugger had pioneered over the previous 3 decades. The electors were no longer independent political actors making decisions based on their own priorities and values. They had become, in effect, customers in a financial services market where Jakob held a monopoly position. Each elector controlled territory that required ongoing access to credit for military forces, infrastructure projects, administrative operations, and personal expenses that exceeded their regular income. Each had become dependent on sophisticated financial services that only the Fugger organization could provide reliably. More importantly, each elector understood that their long-term political survival depended on maintaining good relationships with whoever became emperor. Supporting the wrong candidate could result in political retaliation, territorial losses, reduced access to imperial resources, and isolation from the power networks that shaped European politics. Under these circumstances, the most rational strategy for individual electors wasn't to choose the candidate they personally preferred, but to choose the candidate most likely to win, and whoever could afford the largest bribes was most likely to win. Jakob recognized this dynamic and saw an opportunity to achieve something unprecedented, using his financial resources to directly control the selection of political leadership at the highest level of European government. Instead of simply lending money to whichever candidate requested it, he chose to provide financing exclusively to Charles V, thereby ensuring that only one candidate would have access to the enormous sums needed to outbid his competitors. This wasn't a neutral business decision. It was a strategic political intervention designed to shape the outcome of the election according to Jakob's preferences. The amounts involved were staggering by any historical standard. Jakob personally provided Charles V with over 540,000 florins for election expenses, roughly equivalent to $20 million in contemporary purchasing power. This represented a substantial fraction of the total wealth of most European kingdoms and exceeded the annual revenues of many territorial governments. The money was used primarily for direct payments to electors and their key supporters, though it also funded elaborate ceremonies, diplomatic entertainments, and other election-related expenses that demonstrated Charles's wealth and political sophistication. But the true scale of Jakob's electoral intervention becomes apparent when we consider not just the money he provided to Charles V, but the money he refused to provide to other candidates. Francis I and Henry VIII both approached the Fugger organization, requesting loans for their own electoral campaigns, offering terms that would have been profitable for any normal business transaction. Jakob declined these requests, effectively ensuring that Charles's competitors couldn't access the capital markets needed to match his electoral spending. This wasn't just about providing money to one candidate, it was about denying money to all other candidates. The political implications of this financial strategy were immediately apparent to contemporary observers. The Venetian ambassador to the imperial court reported that the election outcome was determined not by political negotiations among the electors, but by the Spanish ducats that Charles V could distribute more generously than his competitors. The French ambassador complained bitterly that Francis I had been defeated not by superior diplomacy or stronger alliances, but by Jakob Fugger's superior credit rating. Even Charles V himself acknowledged that his victory was due primarily to financial rather than political factors. The specific mechanisms through which electoral bribery operated reveal the sophistication of political corruption in early modern Europe. Direct payments to electors were typically disguised as loans, gifts, or payments for services that provided plausible legal cover while serving the same functional purposes as outright bribes. Electors might receive substantial loans that were never expected to be repaid, valuable presents that far exceeded normal diplomatic exchanges, or payments for ceremonial positions that involved minimal actual responsibilities. These arrangements maintained the fiction that electoral decisions were based on political merit, while ensuring that financial considerations determined the actual outcomes. Jakob's organization coordinated these payments with mathematical precision that reflected their advanced accounting capabilities and political intelligence networks. They knew exactly how much money each elector required to secure their vote, what forms of payment each preferred to maintain legal and political cover, and how to time these payments to maximize their political impact while minimizing the risk of discovery by competing candidates. The election bribery operation was managed with the same systematic efficiency that characterized the Fugger organization's mining and trading activities. The most revealing aspect of the 1519 election was how completely it transformed the relationship between economic and political power. Previous electoral competitions had involved some financial considerations, but political factors had remained primary. Candidates needed noble support, military credibility, diplomatic skill, and dynastic legitimacy to be taken seriously, regardless of their financial resources. The 1519 election demonstrated that sufficient financial resources could overcome any combination of political disadvantages, while insufficient financial resources could negate any combination of political advantages. This transformation wasn't temporary or exceptional. It established a new template for political competition that would shape European politics for centuries. Future imperial elections would be determined primarily by financial rather than political considerations. Territorial princes learned that political survival depended more on maintaining good relationships with major financiers than on traditional forms of noble alliance building. Even church officials discovered that religious authority was subordinated to economic analysis when major political decisions were being made. The election results confirmed the effectiveness of Jakob's strategy. Charles V secured the imperial throne with a unanimous electoral vote, despite lacking the military advantages of Francis I or the diplomatic flexibility of Henry VIII. The electors understood that Charles was the only candidate with access to the financial resources needed to govern the empire effectively, making his election a foregone conclusion once Jakob committed to supporting him exclusively. The other candidates withdrew from serious competition once they realized they couldn't match Charles's financial advantages. But the most significant consequence of the 1519 election wasn't Charles V's victory. It was the demonstration that European political leadership could be purchased by whoever possessed sufficient financial resources. Jakob had proven that emperors could be bought and sold like any other commodity, provided the buyer understood the market mechanisms and had access to adequate capital. This knowledge would reshape political competition throughout Europe as other financiers learned to replicate Jakob's techniques and political leaders learned to accommodate the new realities of financial politics. The 1519 election also established a template for the relationship between financial power and political authority that remains recognizable today. Charles V became emperor, but Jakob Fugger became the power behind the throne. Charles possessed formal authority and public recognition, but Jakob controlled the financial analysis and strategic planning that determined how imperial authority was actually exercised. Charles could make political decisions, but only within parameters defined by his ongoing financial dependence on the Fugger organization. The elected leader served, in effect, as the chief executive officer of a political enterprise that was owned and controlled by its major creditor. This was the final transformation of Jakob Fugger from merchant banker to political architect. He had demonstrated that sufficient financial expertise, properly applied, could control not just individual political decisions, but the basic mechanisms through which political authority was allocated and exercised. The Holy Roman Empire had become, in all but name, a Fugger subsidiary, with the emperor serving as a highly visible but ultimately subordinate manager of an enterprise whose real decisions were made in Augsburg rather than in the imperial court. But by 1519, traditional medieval politics had been fundamentally transformed by the innovations that Jakob Fugger had pioneered over the previous 3 decades. The electors were no longer independent political actors making decisions based on their own priorities and values. They had become, in effect, customers in a financial services market where Jakob held a monopoly position. Each elector controlled territory that required ongoing access to credit for military forces, infrastructure projects, administrative operations, and personal expenses that exceeded their regular income. Each had become dependent on sophisticated financial services that only the Fugger organization could provide reliably. More importantly, each elector understood that their long-term political survival depended on maintaining good relationships with whoever became emperor. Supporting the wrong candidate could result in political retaliation, territorial losses, reduced access to imperial resources, and isolation from the power networks that shaped European politics. Under these circumstances, the most rational strategy for individual electors wasn't to choose the candidate they personally preferred, but to choose the candidate most likely to win. And whoever could afford the largest bribes was most likely to win. Jakob recognized this dynamic and saw an opportunity to achieve something unprecedented, using his financial resources to directly control the selection of political leadership at the highest level of European government. Instead of simply lending money to whichever candidate requested it, he chose to provide financing exclusively to Charles V, thereby ensuring that only one candidate would have access to the enormous sums needed to outbid his competitors. This wasn't a neutral business decision. It was a strategic political intervention designed to shape the outcome of the election according to Jakob's preferences. The amounts involved were staggering by any historical standard. Jakob personally provided Charles V with over 540,000 florins for election expenses, roughly equivalent to $20 million in contemporary purchasing power. This represented a substantial fraction of the total wealth of most European kingdoms and exceeded the annual revenues of many territorial governments. The money was used primarily for direct payments to electors and their key supporters, though it also funded elaborate ceremonies, diplomatic entertainments, and other election-related expenses that demonstrated Charles's wealth and political sophistication. But the true scale of Jakob's electoral intervention becomes apparent when we consider not just the money he provided to Charles V, but the money he refused to provide to other candidates. Francis I and Henry VIII both approached the Fugger organization, requesting loans for their own electoral campaigns, offering terms that would have been profitable for any normal business transaction. Jakob declined these requests, effectively ensuring that Charles's competitors couldn't access the capital markets needed to match his electoral spending. This wasn't just about providing money to one candidate, it was about denying money to all other candidates. The political implications of this financial strategy were immediately apparent to contemporary observers. The Venetian ambassador to the imperial court reported that the election outcome was determined not by political negotiations among the electors, but by the Spanish ducats that Charles V could distribute more generously than his competitors. The French ambassador complained bitterly that Francis I had been defeated not by superior diplomacy or stronger alliances, but by Jakob Fugger's superior credit rating. Even Charles V himself acknowledged that his victory was due primarily to financial rather than political factors. The specific mechanisms through which electoral bribery operated reveal the sophistication of political corruption in early modern Europe. Direct payments to electors were typically disguised as loans, gifts, or payments for services that provided plausible legal cover while serving the same functional purposes as outright bribes. Electors might receive substantial loans that were never expected to be repaid, valuable presents that far exceeded normal diplomatic exchanges, or payments for ceremonial positions that involved minimal actual responsibilities. These arrangements maintained the fiction that electoral decisions were based on political merit, while ensuring that financial considerations determined the actual outcomes. Jakob's organization coordinated these payments with mathematical precision that reflected their advanced accounting capabilities and political intelligence networks. They knew exactly how much money each elector required to secure their vote, what forms of payment each preferred to maintain legal and political cover, and how to time these payments to maximize their political impact while minimizing the risk of discovery by competing candidates. The election bribery operation was managed with the same systematic efficiency that characterized the Fugger organization's mining and trading activities. The most revealing aspect of the 1519 election was how completely it transformed the relationship between economic and political power. Previous electoral competitions had involved some financial considerations, but political factors had remained primary. Candidates needed noble support, military credibility, diplomatic skill, and dynastic legitimacy to be taken seriously, regardless of their financial resources. The 1519 election demonstrated that sufficient financial resources could overcome any combination of political disadvantages, while insufficient financial resources could negate any combination of political advantages. This transformation wasn't temporary or exceptional. It established a new template for political competition that would shape European politics for centuries. Future imperial elections would be determined primarily by financial rather than political considerations. Territorial princes learned that political survival depended more on maintaining good relationships with major financiers than on traditional forms of noble alliance building. Even church officials discovered that religious authority was subordinated to economic analysis when major political decisions were being made. The election results confirmed the effectiveness of Jakob's strategy. Charles V secured the imperial throne with a unanimous electoral vote, despite lacking the military advantages of Francis I or the diplomatic flexibility of Henry VIII. The electors understood that Charles was the only candidate with access to the financial resources needed to govern the empire effectively, making his election a foregone conclusion once Jakob committed to supporting him exclusively. The other candidates withdrew from serious competition once they realized they couldn't match Charles's financial advantages. But the most significant consequence of the 1519 election wasn't Charles V's victory. It was the demonstration that European political leadership could be purchased by whoever possessed sufficient financial resources. Jakob had proven that emperors could be bought and sold like any other commodity, provided the buyer understood the market mechanisms and had access to adequate capital. This knowledge would reshape political competition throughout Europe as other financiers learned to replicate Jakob's techniques and political leaders learned to accommodate the new realities of financial politics. The 1519 election also established a template for the relationship between financial power and political authority that remains recognizable today. Charles V became emperor, but Jakob Fugger became the power behind the throne. Charles possessed formal authority and public recognition, but Jakob controlled the financial analysis and strategic planning that determined how imperial authority was actually exercised. Charles could make political decisions, but only within parameters defined by his ongoing financial dependence on the Fugger organization. The elected leader served, in effect, as the chief executive officer of a political enterprise that was owned and controlled by its major creditor. This was the final transformation of Jakob Fugger from merchant banker to political architect. He had demonstrated that sufficient financial expertise, properly applied, could control not just individual political decisions, but the basic mechanisms through which political authority was allocated and exercised. The Holy Roman Empire had become, in all but name, a Fugger subsidiary, with the emperor serving as a highly visible but ultimately subordinate manager of an enterprise whose real decisions were made in Augsburg rather than in the imperial court. Chapter 6. Emperor on a Leash. Charles V may have worn the crown, but Jakob Fugger held the chain. The relationship that developed between the newly elected Holy Roman Emperor and his banker represents one of history's most sophisticated examples of financial control over political authority, a prototype for the too-big-to-fail dynamics that characterize modern relationships between governments and major financial institutions. What appeared to be a simple creditor-debtor relationship was actually something far more complex, a systematic restructuring of imperial governance that subordinated traditional political authority to the mathematical logic of financial optimization. The scale of Charles V's dependence on Jakob became apparent immediately after the election, when the new emperor discovered that his electoral debts represented only a fraction of his total financial obligations. The Holy Roman Empire that Charles inherited wasn't just politically complex, it was financially bankrupt. Previous emperors had financed their activities through short-term borrowing that pushed major costs into the future, assuming that territorial expansion or increased tax revenues would eventually provide the resources needed to service their debts. Instead, Charles inherited accumulated debts that exceeded the empire's annual revenues by a factor of 3 to 1. Traditional approaches to imperial finance were completely inadequate for addressing this crisis. The empire's revenues came primarily from territorial taxes that were limited by feudal agreements dating back centuries, customs duties from trade routes that were increasingly controlled by independent commercial organizations, and mining taxes from operations that were now largely owned by the Fuggers themselves. These revenue sources were insufficient even for normal administrative expenses, much less for servicing the massive debts that Charles had inherited along with his imperial title. Jakob's solution to this financial crisis revealed the same systematic thinking that had characterized his previous innovations in mining and banking. Instead of simply providing additional loans that would increase Charles's debt burden, he proposed a comprehensive restructuring of imperial finances that would integrate government operations with Fugger business activities. Under this arrangement, the Fugger organization would assume responsibility for managing imperial revenues and expenditures, while Charles would retain formal political authority over policy decisions that fell within financial parameters established by Fugger analysis. This restructuring was presented as a temporary administrative arrangement designed to restore imperial finances to sustainable levels, but its practical effects were far more profound and permanent. Charles lost direct control over government revenues, which were now collected and managed by Fugger representatives who applied commercial accounting standards to government operations. He lost authority over major expenditure decisions, which required prior approval from Fugger analysts, who evaluated all government spending according to mathematical criteria that prioritized debt service and financial stability over traditional political objectives. Most importantly, Charles lost the ability to make policy decisions that might have significant financial implications without consulting with Jakob and his associates, who possessed the technical expertise needed to evaluate complex economic consequences that the emperor couldn't analyze independently. The imperial government gradually became dependent on Fugger analysis for everything from military planning to diplomatic strategy to religious policy, since virtually every government decision had financial ramifications that could only be understood through sophisticated economic modeling. The genius of this arrangement was that it provided genuine benefits to both parties while fundamentally altering the relationship between political and economic authority in ways that weren't immediately apparent to most observers. Charles gained access to the financial resources and technical expertise needed to govern the empire effectively, while Jakob gained direct influence over imperial policy decisions and virtually unlimited access to government resources for his business activities. Both parties could legitimately claim that the arrangement served their interests, making it difficult for critics to characterize it as simply exploitative. The specific mechanisms through which financial control operated reveal the sophistication of early modern political economy. The Fugger organization didn't simply dictate policy to Charles. They provided him with analytical frameworks and decision-making processes that made their preferred outcomes appear logically inevitable. When Charles needed to decide between competing military strategies, Fugger analysts would provide detailed cost-benefit analyses that systematically favored options that served broader Fugger interests while appearing to optimize imperial objectives. When diplomatic negotiations required complex trade-offs between different policy goals, Fugger representatives would offer mathematical models that consistently pointed toward solutions that enhanced the organization's commercial position.